Welcome to another episode of the Listen and Learn series. In this episode, we're specifically going to talk about voting rights as it relates to African Americans in America. And with that, we have to start with the 15th Amendment of 1870. So essentially, in 1870, the 15th Amendment said you should have the right to vote and you should not be denied against that right on the basis of your race, your color, or your previous servitude. So, in a nutshell, if you were previously a slave, according to the 15th Amendment in 1870, you should have had the right to vote. Now, let's be clear, this did not apply to women because, as we know, women did not get the right to vote until 1920 via the 19th Amendment. This also did not apply to men under the age of 21 because at this time the voting age was 21. The voting age did not get to 18 until 1971. So now we have this 15th Amendment in 1870, and essentially, black men over the age of 21 should have been given the right to vote. But unfortunately, they were threatened and ultimately given a hard time, preventing them from being able to exercise their civic duty and ultimate right to vote. So I'll give you an example of some of the things that were preventing them. On top of the threats, you have voting restrictions that were in place, and one of those examples were poll taxes. So typically, poll taxes were put in place, and it was a tax that you had to pay in order for you to be able to vote. So if you can just think about the times that we're in 1870 and the time shortly thereafter, this frankly was a financial burden, and many black people just simply could not afford to pay poll taxes. Another barrier or literacy tests. And essentially, the literacy test would require a person who is seeking to register to vote to have to read a section of the state constitution and either explain it to the clerk of court, and then the clerk of court could then decide very subjectively if that person was literate or not. If they decided that the person was not literate, they were not then granted the right to vote. In some places, there were actually physical tests. I'm from Louisiana. I, for fun, looked up what the literacy test was when this was a thing, and I would encourage you to look up samples of literacy tests and the questions that were asked on literacy tests. It's quite fascinating. I'll put a link below this video so you can see a sample of some of the literacy test questions. If you've ever seen the movie The Help, that is a good depiction of what literacy testing looked like and the opportunity that someone, the measures that people went through, constantly showing up seeking the right to be able to register to vote and constantly being denied because they were said to have failed a literacy test. Another example is the grandfather clause, and essentially that permitted registering to vote for anyone whose grandfather would have been qualified before the Civil War. So before the Civil War, obviously, this would only be of value to white citizens. If we remember the Civil War, the reason why it was fought to determine whether or not slaves, in fact, should be free. So we know before the Civil War, no one black, no grandfather before the Civil War who was black had the right to vote. So that's another example. So, did these restrictions work? Yes, in fact, they did. Did the scare tactics, the poll taxes, the literacy test, and the grandfather clause and things like that work to prevent black people from actually registering to vote and voting? And in fact, they did, because after the 15th Amendment in 1870, although blacks were given the right to vote, legally, the right to vote, in 1940, statistics say that only 3% of blacks in the South were actually registered to vote. And this is not because they weren't interested, but again, there were barriers in place preventing them from voting. So let's fast forward to 1963, the March on Washington, well known for the famous I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered. I've heard so many people say that Martin Luther King Jr., one of the things we know he fought for civil rights, and it was way bigger than the Voting Right Act. But you hear a lot of people associate the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, and I believe it's because of the timing. So we have the March on Washington in 1963, the Voters' Right Act of 1965 passed, which essentially said that blacks were going to be allowed the right to vote, and it prevented any racial discrimination. So no more poll taxes. These things are now outlawed and illegal. So let's fast forward. Is it all good? Do we have any barriers in place that prevents blacks, minorities, youth, or any people from voting? I wish I could say that there are no barriers, but that's not in fact the case. There are still tactics and things that take place. For example, one example would be some places requiring that you use government issued IDs. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but that is discriminatory typically to minorities and youth. That's one example. Another is gerrymandering. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but essentially it's the idea that it's the practice of drawing boundaries around electoral districts, and it's said to give one political party an unfair advantage over its rivals. It dilutes voting power essentially, and I've heard of racial gerrymandering. It's not, if you ever see a map and how the gerrymandering works, it's not like these neat little boxes. It is strategic, methodical lines drawn around a map. Every 10 years, when we have the census, the districts can be redrawn. So, yes, gerrymandering itself, in the essence of who it's named after and how it came about, is in fact illegal. But many have said it's a little bit of a challenge to prove that is actually what happens. So, I'll end with this. This is not about politics. If you look at the history in itself of the political parties, that's an interesting study in itself to see the history of our political parties as they are today in America and what they traditionally were. So I would submit to you that this is not about politics, but what it is about is that you understanding the blood, sweat, and tears that were shed for our right to vote. So this is not about politics, but what it is about you exercising your civic duty to vote. And don't let anyone tell you that your vote doesn't count. Every single vote counts. Every single vote matters. So make sure that you educate yourself about the history of voting rights in America from 1870 right now to 2020, and make sure that you exercise your right to vote. This is the 10th and final episode of this season of the Listen and Learn series. I have something in store for the second season, and I can't wait to share that with you. But what I would encourage you to do is go back and look at the last 10 videos and reflect on some of the topics that we have discussed. I can't wait to share the next season with you. I would encourage you to like this video, and I would encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you are the first in the know when I announce this weekend what the next season of the Listen and Learn series will entail. Until then, keep listening, keep learning, and keep being bold. Have a great day.